Most people think a witness is someone who speaks in court, someone who takes the stand, answers questions, and becomes part of the official story. But in real investigations, the most important witnesses often never speak at all, not because they disappeared, not because they refused, but because no one ever asked them to testify. This case contains a witness like that, someone who was identified early, documented clearly, and referenced more than once, a person whose proximity to the events was never disputed. And yet, when the case reached its most critical stages, this witness was absent, not excluded by a ruling, not disqualified by law, simply never called. At first, this doesn't stand out. Files are full of names. Not everyone ends up testifying. That's normal. What isn't normal is when a witness is repeatedly acknowledged as relevant, yet never questioned in a formal setting. In this file, the witness is described as present, aware, and in a position to observe. Those are not casual words. They are signals. They tell you this person mattered. Despite that, there is no transcript, no sworn statement presented in court, no record of direct questioning under oath. The witness exists on paper, but not in the process that actually determines truth. And that gap is where things start to feel wrong. As the investigation develops, other testimonies begin to shape the narrative. These testimonies come from people further removed from the core events, people who relied on secondhand information or assumptions. Their statements are given weight, analyzed, compared. Meanwhile, the witness who was closest remains untouched by the formal machinery of justice. What makes this particularly unsettling is that there is no documented reason for the omission, no motion to exclude, no challenge to credibility, no concern raised about reliability. The witness simply fades out of the process, and when something disappears without explanation, it usually means it was never meant to be examined closely. Inside the file, there are moments where this witness is indirectly referenced. Phrases like those present at the time or individuals on site appear, but they're vague. They dissolve the person into a group, making it harder to notice that one specific voice is missing. This kind of language creates distance. It turns a concrete individual into an abstract category. There is also a subtle shift in how relevance is defined. Instead of asking who had the clearest view, the investigation focuses on who fits best into the existing narrative. Testimony becomes less about proximity and more about compatibility. Statements that align are elevated. Statements that might complicate things are quietly deprioritized. This is where most people assume there must be a strategic reason. Maybe the witness would have contradicted themselves. Maybe their account wasn't clear. But those explanations don't appear anywhere in the record. And when an explanation doesn't exist on paper, it can't be evaluated. The absence itself becomes the decision. What's important to understand is that courts don't automatically hear every relevant witness. They hear the witnesses they are presented with, and the decision of who gets presented often happens long before anyone steps into a courtroom. It happens during preparation, during framing, during the moment when a case decides what it is about. In this case, the moment arrives early. The structure of the argument solidifies before the witness is ever given a chance to speak. Once it happens, introducing a new voice becomes risky, not because it's unreliable, but because it might introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous to a clean case. As the file moves forward, the witness becomes a shadow, still referenced, still acknowledged, but never allowed to occupy center stage. It's as if the system recognizes their importance, but doesn't know what to do with it, so it chooses the easiest option: silence. By the time the case reaches court, the absence is complete. The witness is not mentioned in opening statements, not addressed in closing arguments. The jury never hears the name, and without hearing it, they never have a reason to ask why they didn't hear it. This is how omission becomes invisible. The system doesn't need to suppress anything. It only needs to proceed as if the missing piece never existed. And once the process moves on, Revisiting the decision becomes increasingly unlikely. At this point, the case still feels coherent. The narrative holds together. There are no obvious holes unless you know where to look, and most people don't look for what isn't there. They evaluate what's presented. They assume completeness, but the witness remains. On paper, in the background, a presence acknowledged but never activated, and that raises a question the case never asks out loud. What would have changed if this person had spoken under oath? That question is uncomfortable, because once you ask it, you can't unask it, and answering it would require confronting why the question was avoided in the first place. The silence around the witness is no longer accidental. It has become structural. The investigation has moved too far forward to easily turn back, and the absence has been absorbed into the logic of the case, not as a flaw, but as a feature. What's striking is how the file treats credibility. Other witnesses are evaluated in detail. Their statements are compared, cross-referenced, and contextualized. Small inconsistencies are explained away. Memory gaps are forgiven. Yet the one person who was in a position to observe key moments is never subjected to that same process. Their credibility is never tested because their voice is never introduced. This creates an imbalance that feels subtle on paper but powerful in practice. The case presents itself as thorough, but thoroughness depends on inclusion, not just repetition. Hearing the same story from multiple angles is not the same as hearing from the right angle. And this witness represented exactly that. There is a section in the file where investigators summarize what they believe the witness would have said, not a direct quote, not a sworn account, a paraphrase. That alone should raise concern. When a system starts speaking on behalf of someone who never spoke, it's no longer collecting testimony, it's managing risk. By summarizing instead of questioning, the investigation maintains control over uncertainty. A live witness introduces unpredictability, tone, hesitation, emphasis. None of that can be fully captured in a report written by someone else. And unpredictability is precisely what the system avoids once a case begins to harden. As the legal process unfolds, the omission becomes harder to challenge. Defense and prosecution both work within the framework they're given. If a witness is never formally presented, there's nothing to cross-examine, nothing to rebut. Silence creates symmetry. Both sides argue around the same empty space. This is where many people assume responsibility shifts. Surely someone would object. Surely someone would notice. But responsibility in complex systems is diffuse. Everyone assumes someone else already made the call. And because the omission isn't dramatic, it doesn't trigger alarms. There is no moment where a gavel falls and says, "This witness will not testify." There is only the quiet continuation of a process that has already decided what it needs. The case concludes without the witness ever stepping forward. The verdict, or final determination, rests on the testimonies that were allowed to shape the narrative. On paper, it appears justified, internally consistent, complete. The missing voice leaves no obvious gap unless you know it was there to begin with. What this reveals is something deeper than a single oversight. It reveals how truth is filtered not just by what is said, but by who is allowed to speak. Access to the process matters as much as access to information. A witness doesn't become relevant by existing. They become relevant by being heard. And once the process decides who will be heard, everything else rearranges itself around that choice. Evidence is weighed differently. Doubt is managed. Conclusions feel safer. The system moves forward with less friction. The uncomfortable question isn't whether the witness would have changed the outcome. That can never be known. The real question is why the system wasn't willing to find out. Why a voice, acknowledged as relevant, was never given the space to introduce uncertainty. Because uncertainty slows things down. It complicates narratives. It forces reevaluation. And systems built for resolution often treat those things as obstacles rather than safeguards. When people later look back at the case, they see what was presented. They don't see what was withheld. Because withholding doesn't leave fingerprints. There's no blank page labeled missing testimony. There's only an absence that feels normal because it was never challenged. This is how cases remain intact even when something essential is missing. Not through deception, but through omission. Not through lies, but through silence, and silence, when formalized, becomes invisible. The witness was never asked to testify, not because they were irrelevant, but because relevance alone isn't enough. You have to fit the shape of the story that's being told. And this witness didn't fit cleanly enough to be safe. Once you understand that, you begin to see similar patterns elsewhere. Other cases, other files, other moments where someone was close enough to matter, but quiet enough to be ignored. This file isn't about what the witness would have said. It's about what happens when a system chooses not to listen. When access to truth is filtered through convenience. When silence is easier than risk, the witness remains in the file, named, acknowledged, permanently unheard, and that silence is part of the outcome, whether anyone admits it or not.